So with that, I like to hand it over to Seth, our second speaker, on his experience in orthopedics or with 3D printing. Seth, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jules. Mariya, that was really inspiring. Thanks for sharing. Here we go. Go. A little over a year ago, on May 19th, I was hit by a car while riding my bike. I ended up having 2 scaphoid fractures and one on my elbow. Tiny little breaks and a huge cast. After a few days of living and sleeping in that monster, I Googled 3D printed casts. There was some amazing stuff out there, including a business in Oakland that would print a cast from your tweets. We just went over this, and I don't really tweet, but so I got in touch with Arthur, or my friend Amy instead. Amy Carl she had a 6-month residency at Autodesk, and she's done amazing work with 3D printed biomaterial and printing the body systems as fashion. She put me in touch with Arthur Harsuvanakit, and at Autodesk, he was beta testing generative software. We chatted, and he agreed to create a cast for me. And best of all, it was at no charge. He plugged the coordinates in for a regular cast and then told the software the places that needed immobilization and the places that needed none. He also figured out the best way to make the cast remove with potential. He also figured out the best way to make the cast removable with the potential for being locked by the doctor. We tried Velcro, snap overs, and we settled on pins in overlapping keyholes. You can see the pins sticking out at the little places. Those aren't always as long. We refined them so that they wouldn't dig into my flesh. We also worked out the kinks, like the movable parts of my arm, how the movable parts of my arm interacted with the cast. You can kind of see how on the top left, how it was kind of squeezing my forearm, and when I twisted my arm, it would hurt. So, and the knuckles were also a little tight at one point. So we kind of did several prototypes, figuring all that out. This whole time we'd been using my right arm, the castless arm, as a model. This brings up the biggest challenge of the whole process, and that was getting my doctor on board. I showed him the prototype and got the tech nurses excited about what we were creating and asked for his help in making the cast better. He ignored me and my requests, and he wouldn't get involved. I don't know what his reasoning was. I think he was just afraid of being sued, or I don't know. But I saw the great potential, and he just kind of backed off. Since he wouldn't go along and I was afraid to ask to have my cast cut off for the initial scan, we used my right arm as the model and created the prototypes from that. At one point, I decided to be my own health advocate through suggestions from friends and colleagues. They're like, just do it. Just ignore your doctor and take care of it yourself. I had a friend take a Dremel to the cast, and she cut it off. It was a little scary, but we had a metal ruler between the blade and my arm, and I trusted her implicitly. So we got it off, and I got to try on the mirrored model onto my left arm. We found out that it wasn't exact. So we adjusted it a couple times, and we taped it back on my arm, and Arthur printed a new one the next day. I was in it. It felt great. Walking along the Embarcadero to meet in Gloria, I felt the wind on my skin for the first time in 2 months, and I felt like my arm was alive again. That night I showered unprotected and washed my right armpit properly after 2 months of doing it with a cast in a plastic bag. The next day I did laps in the pool. The water completely ran over my arm, and it felt amazing. I'd only ridden the stationary bike for 2 months, and now I could exercise my entire body. So let's talk about the pros and cons of a traditional cast versus a 3D printed cast. Excessive mobilization. It was completely, every part of my arm was immobilized, even though I only needed to immobilize a couple areas. It was super cumbersome. It was way too thick for what I believed it needed to be. It irritated my skin. Where the cast hit my elbow, it was constantly rubbing. The dead skin cells rotted on my flesh while the cast was holding my arm captive. It was itchy. The doctor told me not to use a hanger, so I found there was no way I couldn't scratch, so I found a long stick from the kitchen, and I was able to relieve some of that itchiness. Another con was I was unable to wash or exercise properly. I had limited clothing options. I couldn't wear any long sleeve shirts for months. And at San Francisco summer, you need to have a long sleeve shirt. It was just ugly. It got sweaty, it got gross. And that's the inside of the cast for, after a couple weeks, and that's the dead skin cells, and that's just disgusting. The pros, my exercise options opened up. My skin was hydrated. It got air. It kept its normal regenerative process. I could scratch without fear of breaking the skin with a hanger. And not just for me, but for other people, it was customizable to each person's requirements. Somebody else whose forearm is broken, but not their hand, would immobilize their forearm and less of their hand, so they could have complete use of their thumb. Somebody who broke their elbow could have a completely different process without having to immobilize their entire arm, and you could extend it to legs and other breaks as well. In the days after getting the final cast, I refined it further. I took off unnecessary material. The band across my knuckles was a little tight and it was hurting, so I removed that. And that was a result of it being mummified for 2 months. It was super sensitive, and it couldn't handle any irritation at all. So this is what I started with. That Munster cast is what they called it. And this is what I ended up. Which one seems cooler? So that's the story. My big takeaway is, if your doctor is afraid and conservative, advocate for your own health. I could have been in the cast much, much sooner if my doctor had been behind the process. Or I could have been in that ugly thing for 3 months and my recovery process would have been a lot slower. When I first saw the physical therapist, she said, "You're kind of further along than you should be, or what's typical for your stage." And I said, well, I was able to take it off and flex the the break or my wrist gently and kind of get it back, start the process of getting it back. It was a little scary taking it off, but I proceeded with extreme caution, and I'm like, if you do it too aggressively, you're going to do it again, and you're going to have to wear this for a lot longer. So I was fairly conservative, and just being able to move my hand gently, I believe, sped the healing process up. And also I believe that the hydration and the aeration were important aspects of it being of healing faster. It was great being part of the design process as another pro, and especially with the Autodesk team and Arthur Harsuvanakit. Making this cool, funky, otherworldly healing mechanism was a super fun adventure. I look forward to the healthcare industry adopting new technologies to allow patients' lives to be impacted as minimally as possible by life's bumps and bruises. And another takeaway is friends were very supportive of this exploration. They were excited to see the process and the progress and the generation, and they were also excited that I was excited, and it was really great to go through that with them. Personally, I was really grateful that it was only those bones that were cracked and not my head or my whole life. So that was really, the whole time I was thankful that I was alive. I hope that this process and what I went through will help change some minds within the healthcare industry. So thanks for letting me share my story.
Thank you, Seth.
This is a really cool, I'm just including this because I think it's really cool. And it's just the cast was amazing. And here's some links to some other. I was called by the Daily Beast because they had gotten a hold of the story, and they wrote a story about my process too. So you might want to check that out. Thanks a lot.
Cool. Thank you, Seth. And what an interesting story. As a complement to Arthur's story on his design, this bringing this patient perspective, this must have been very liberating to wear such a 3D printed cast, and it looks quite cool too. So now we will move to the Q&A segment and maybe have some conversation between speakers and audience in between. And I was triggered by something that Jan Ground wrote in the chat box about the risks that could have made things worse. Of course, you are pioneering using these technologies, and you mentioned the process of getting the old cast off your arm. Was this any time on your mind? Any risks involved, or how did you deal with this?
Risks of taking it off? Well, I initially tried to get my doctor to take it off and work with me to put a temporary cast on so I could go to Autodesk, get a scan, and come back and get it permanently. But he basically just ignored me. And so at one point I was like, I'm gonna lose my window. I'm gonna end up having this on for the whole time. And I needed a scan, and the right hand didn't mirror the left hand exactly. So I had the cast, and I just called my friend Janelle and said, take it off. And I mean, it was a risk, and it wasn't traditional, but I felt like completely worth it.
Yeah, I applaud you for it, because the whole journey, of course, was a risk. I know that Shauna had a nurse perspective on this too.
Well, so first of all, I applaud you for being advocating for that and asking all these questions and pursuing different pieces. I'm curious on two things. One, when your physician, when you brought this to, I'm assuming it's to him because 97% of orthopedic surgeons are men. What were the concerns? I mean, why did he shut you down on the conversation? Because I can imagine that from the standpoint of keeping you safe, I mean, that it's while it's cumbersome, you know, those bones are really tiny and any type of movement can really get in the way of healing. So there's a lot of reason to make sure that we keep the whole area protected. And it's a really good sign to everybody else, do not touch me. So there's a lot of safety. And then you can answer that. But the other thing I was wondering, did the nurses, as far as scratching yourself, the best tool for that is a knitting needle. And I'm curious if they suggested that to you. Because when you're saying that with the hanger, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, like infection.
No, I ended up using a chopstick, which was...
That's a good one too. I mean...
and it was nicely enameled and smooth on the outside.
Good. Yeah. Yeah, the hanger, you had me worried there.
Well, the instructions were basically don't scratch.
That's not possible.
Which is
That's
not...
like saying don't itch.
Yeah, don't stick anything in your cast to scratch. And they didn't offer a knitting needle as an option. I had to make do, and I figured out what I felt was a safe option. Yeah. The doctor part, at one point I emailed him and just asked him, when I was approaching him with the potential, he basically I felt like he misinterpreted my question and said, I'm glad you're deciding to go with the traditional option, which was completely not my proposal with him. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I just ignored him because I felt like I was giving him an opportunity to be on the vanguard, and he was totally rejecting it. And also, I felt like this is gonna speed my healing process. This is gonna make my healing process more efficient. It's gonna make it better. And basically, I just said, no, it's time for me to take over. And if my doctor isn't going to help me, then I'm going to help myself.
So this is Dan Ground. Sorry.
Go ahead.
It's Jan. And I got to tell you, this is somewhat life-changing for me. I've been in the healthcare industry since 1979, and I've told people all my life that medicine is an art, not a science. And I'm reading a book right now, I just posted in the chat, called Complications, A Surgeon's Note on an Imperfect Science. Atul Gawande, who's going to run the Amazon Chase Morgan healthcare company. And I'm reading about every surgeon makes mistakes, every single one of them. And I'm listening to you guys, you folks who have taken it on yourself, and I'm completely wowed. And I think we all need to do this more. I think doctors certainly in general know best. I've worked for them for 40 years, and I think they know best. But if we have doubts, Seth and Mariya, I'll be in touch with you. So I just want you to know I'm thinking that. I'm 61 years old. I've done nothing outside the healthcare industry, and I agree with what you've done. So standing ovation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. And what really makes me sad is in listening to these conversations that there's not a greater receptiveness, and it sounds like we just have not had really good communication. And too many times when we have patients, we want patients to be activated and engaged. And the moment they become activated, engaged, we kind of look at this as, oh man, this is more than I wanted to take on. And we don't really invite those conversations to be more productive. So it makes me sad. And it's also really, again, a wake-up call to each of us as professionals when somebody comes in and says, hey, I've got this other way of thinking about it. The best way to respond to that is, interesting, let's research this a little bit more, as opposed to shutting down the conversation. So it makes me sad, and I'm sorry that was the experience that you had.
But so have you ever heard of a colleague, a physician colleague, who has listened to a patient's request to do it differently and said, I'll think about it, ever?
Yes, I have.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I was going to say my experience around that is that a lot, and I'm probably in a very self-selected group that are the experimenters and the people who are comfortable in places where we don't know what all the answers are. And I'm so glad you read Atul's book. And if you haven't read Better and Checklist Manifesto and all those others, they are brilliant.
I will.
Yeah, I think what he does is really helps us to understand that so much of this and the progress that we've made has been because there's been a willingness to experiment. And it's been usually patients who are looking at this and saying, help me. And then you find a team and a set of partners who are, I don't know, but if you're willing to try and to trust, I'm there with you. And oftentimes when those conversations get shut down, what I have seen is that it's a certain degree of fear, a certain degree of safety concerns that are really hard to explain, and then also some very bad experiences where things have gone really wrong. So, I think, Seth, part of it is you did really well, but I can promise you there are 100 ways where that could have gone wrong. It doesn't always go wrong, but that there's a reason why oftentimes these things are approached with an enormous amount of reluctance, because when you see things go bad, they go really bad, and where you've got a known pathway where it's going to progress, that's so much a safer route to go than somebody who loses their entire hand or loses the function of it because we didn't stick to something that we understand better.
Yeah, I would have loved to have him present the risks and say, well, this is what happens if you do this. This is what happens if you do this. But the conversation didn't. And I think that, I researched that particular break, and I talked to people who had that break who didn't treat it properly. And basically one of them can't use his thumb anymore. And I was aware, and I think having a patient who's not reckless is essential to this process as well. I'm definitely not a reckless person. I'm cautious in my adventure. But I think that's kind of necessary. And I would have loved to have a doctor, because I think he could have had important input on this cast and said, well, you could do this better by doing this and this and this, where it was basically two designers, one of them a patient, going through this process. And I think his input would have been super instrumental if we would have had it. And I understand this is a litigation culture, and he was probably very worried about that, but I don't know. I just hope for better.
Well, having these types of conversations lead to that. So I appreciate you sharing the story and encouraging us to be better at our conversations when we invite patients to be activated, that we are more receptive to their suggestions.
Yeah, I believe I was the only person in San Francisco with a 3D printed cast while I had it. And I don't think that I was the only person with a broken wrist. I think there are a lot of broken bones walking around San Francisco, and it would have been great to see somebody else in their alien exoskeleton as well. It would be great to walk down the street and see everybody with a broken bone.
Exactly, especially with this design. And following on that, Tim posted a question. How did your post-cast checkup go? Did it all heal properly, and did you get any kudos from any doctors?
The physical therapist was super. She's like, why are you healing so fast? On the first visit, why do you have this mobility? And it's because I was able to flex gently. I was able to take the cast off and, just move it minimally and get it back to where it could move again. And I think, and that was the last 2 weeks. And I think just that, and also the hydration and the aeration, contributed a lot to the healing process. And also just swimming. I exercised and I got my heart rate up, and I was able to exercise. And I think that was essential to the healing process. And I think that was great. And I've been out of it for a year, and I got it off late August or mid-August last year. And I stopped seeing the physical therapist in December and started with a personal trainer who is aware of the injury. And he's worked with me a lot to build the strength back up. And I'm about 97% right now, after less than a year. And I guess I could get another x-ray, but I posted a photo of me doing a full wheel, which is a back bend in yoga, after about 3 months of it being out.
Wow.
And my yoga teacher was super supportive as well. He was aware of my injury, and he told me things to do to not stress it and also build the strength back up. So I think that was really essential as well.
Yeah, wonderful. So I guess this is also an opportunity for commercial businesses. Shauna just showed me there's this company Cast 21 who is in this area as well. And with that, we are actually at the top of the hour. I would like to thank everyone that joined today's session, and in particular our wonderful speakers that took the time to share their special journeys. And with that, I'd like to hand things over to Cynthia of the ILM.